Okay, welcome to the very first of a series of videos which we're making at the National Firearms Centre here in Leeds. With me is Jonathan Ferguson, the Curator of Firearms here, and we have on the table in front of us some very significant small arms in the history of British military adoptions of military firearms post the Second World War. We have an EM1 rifle, the Thorpe rifle, we have an EM2, the Janssen rifle, and we have a very early 280 caliber FAL designed by Duidon Save. So first of all, we're going to start off, and I'd like to ask Jonathan really what the purpose is of the National Firearms Centre and how it came to be.
Sure. Probably a useful question for viewers. People tend to know the name the Pattern Room. In our world, you know, it's still known and sort of respected. That institution technically has ceased to exist. The collection, thankfully, due to some careful negotiations back in early 2000, was gifted to the Royal Armouries in 2005. So just to wind things back a bit, to try and explain the background, the Pattern Room is, I was going to say it's what it sounds like, but it's a little bit opaque for most people. The British military system for equipment was to use something called a sealed pattern, and perhaps you'll pick that up in future videos and explain that in more detail. But literally, the Royal Seal of Approval, to say that this tunic, belt plate, in this case, firearm, is to the specification required. That's gone through all the trials, it's every little nut, bolt and detail as it should be. At the time, that was a means of governing manufacture, so whether it's the state factory at Enfield, where the Pattern Room was co-located, or whether that's a contractor making you 20,000 monkey tail carbines or whatever it might be, they hopefully turn in samples that match exactly the sealed pattern. What that means today is, settles a lot of arguments at the bar, basically, as to what detail should or shouldn't be on a given weapon, and they are vital, really important and rare historical artifacts.
So the Pattern Room also contained the gauges from which to check the specification of the parts of the firearms as well, and to ensure really interchangeability as far as the small arms are concerned.
That's right. Not all of the gauges have survived, and indeed not all of the sealed patterns have survived. But yeah, that was the idea. We have, again, something you might want to look at, and a big set of inspection gauges for the Pattern 53 rifle, along with an example of an interchangeable Pattern 53 rifle. Couldn't get interchangeable P53s until 1856.
Wow.
It took a while for Sam Colt's idea to really sort of catch on and be implemented fully. And then even, of course, probably not until the Second World War would you get most firearms truly interchangeable. Going further back in the history of, well, not even the Pattern Room, but people may have heard of the factory at Enfield. As I say, that's where the Pattern Room was located. That was the main small arms factory for the UK, the main arsenal for the UK. Prior to that, and that came on stream, if you like, 1823, something like, maybe 1818, I think is the earliest date I've read for the Enfield factory being in operation, obviously pre most machine forms of manufacture, but nonetheless a manufactory rather than making things by cottage industry means, or what used to be the case, which is the ordnance system. Again, we won't go into the details of that, but the lock, stock and barrel thing. Three major parts made by different craftsmen, put together, or set up as they called it, at the Tower of London. So in a way, the Tower of London, which is still, we still have galleries there, it's one of our sites. The HQ has moved up here to Leeds, but we still have the Tower. That, if you like, used to be the main arsenal for the kingdom. Moved in the early 1800s to Enfield, and in effect the Pattern Room did too. There wasn't a Pattern Room by name at the Tower of London, but the same functions took place there. And indeed, over the decades, over the centuries, the sort of obsolete sealed patterns would either remain behind at the Tower of London, or they'd be transferred from the Pattern Room to the Tower of London. where I'm going with this is you end up by the early 2000s with some sealed patterns in one collection, because they're not really relevant to modern arms production, and some in the pattern room. And in 2005 we were able to bring them together.
Great.
And that's what the National Firearms Centre is. It's the location where most of this firearms collection resides. It's laid out just like the old pattern room, and just like the old pattern room, if you have a good reason, you can get in and you can study what it is you want to study.
Okay. Just as a rough idea, about how many individual firearms does the National Firearms Centre hold? Not accoutrements or accessories, but actual firearms.
The benefits of a modern database system is that we can tell exactly how many we've got. Having said that, I probably don't have the exact figure off the top of my head, but 16,000 in this facility where we are now, and overall across in other stores in the museum, on loan around the world, we have in total 26,000 firearms of all types, from medieval hand cannon to the very latest polymer framed pistols.
So you can say with virtual certainty that this is the largest single collection of firearms available in one location.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, shorthand is to say it's the best collection in the world.
Yes.
We try not to say that because in certain other areas there may well be
Sure.
better, smaller collections, and there will certainly be bigger collections of AKs upon AKs,
Yes.
or whatever they happen to be. But the breadth of this collection is just it's an accident of history almost.
Yes.
That both the Royal Armouries were collecting interesting and unusual, but also bog standard reference examples, and then the pattern room came on and did the same thing, and the two came together.
Yes. So we spent some time earlier going through the halls where the collection is stored, and I had given Jonathan a list of small arms that I wanted to see, and we saw every one. There are gaps in the collection, certainly, because you just can't have one of everything, but there are some items here where they're definitely one of a kind, or one of only a few in the world, which we've seen today. And there are some unique items which there is only one, and you have it. The one thing that I think that I picked up on is we saw serial number 1 Taden gun, which the Taden was developed around about the same time as these firearms, but it was a belt-fed machine gun firing the 280 cartridge, and the one that's in the hall is serial number 1.
Sort of a belt-fed Bren gun, isn't it?
Yes, but it scaled down a little bit and improved as well, and we'll hopefully be looking at that at a later date as well. So we're going to go through a few different firearms today, giving you a brief overview, but the idea is that this will turn into a series where you can suggest to us what you would like to see, and if there's one here, we'll certainly try and show you it. We'll try and answer questions. If you've got a query about a certain firearm, we'll certainly try and find that for you, and we'll try and show you a firearm that you may want to see that you've not seen before. We're in a unique position at the moment that we have access, courtesy of the Royal Armouries, to this collection, and hopefully this will be able to show you guys out there some items which just won't be available to you. The Armouries is available to researchers, collectors, by appointment. How would you go about that?
That's right. As you say, we are part of the Royal Armouries overall, and the same applies to any area of the collection, armour, edged weapons, and indeed our firearms collection. Simply, you can contact us through the website. It's probably the easiest way. And if it's firearm related, it'll probably end up in my inbox.
Okay.
And then it's essentially part of the function of the pattern room, and indeed this collection, is to support the work of the authorities here in the UK. But we are first and foremost a national museum, and this collection, for example, we've already drawn upon it to redisplay our First World War gallery, and we'll continue to do so. So there's that aspect. Whether something's in the stores here, in the stores in the main museum, or even on display with sufficient notice, and again email is the best way to do
Sure.
it, if you are writing a book, writing an article, have a genuine interest, you have a collection of something yourself, or provided you have a genuine interest. It's quite hard to quantify that, isn't it? But we know each other when we see each other.
Yes.
Or speak.
Yeah.
So the sort of rubbernecking, I'm afraid we haven't got time for,
no.
And indeed the pattern room didn't. But we are perhaps actually, despite what people may think about how hard it is to get in here, we're actually more likely to be able to provide some time for you to study something.
Sure.
If you can tell us what it is you want to see with as much notice as possible, we'll get you in.
Sure, okay. But I think really what you need to put across is that it's not a gun shop. You're not coming here to browse. You're coming here for a reason. And
Correct.
the reason would be to research a particular gun or a particular design aspect, whether you're a history buff, designer, or you have some forensic interest in the firearm.
As well. Yeah.
So this is a worldwide accessible collection.
Yeah.
If you get through the security clearance.
Yes, photo ID is absolutely imperative, and we have our procedures here.
Sure.
That we won't go into as to get in. But it's again, if you are a bona fide researcher, and that can include just enthusiastic interest,
sure,
provided there's some sort of evidence of it, the website or some notes you've made or something.
Okay, thank you for explaining that to us, Jonathan. It's a very interesting collection. Well, I think that's an understatement in itself. What we're going to do now is we're going to give you over of the EM1, the EM2, and the 280 FAL. We'll go through some of the design aspects of all the rifles, and then if you have any questions, we can visit that on the website. So let's see what we can show to you today. I know of myself, I've never handled an EM1. I've actually fired an EM2 in 7.62, but I've never seen an EM1. So I'm very interested to see the differences and the idiosyncrasies between the two weapons. My interest as an engineer is that I know that the EM2 was flapper locked. The EM1 being roller locked really is the better technology, but I now know why there was a pitfall and it wasn't proceeded with. So let's look into the different weapons and we'll go from there. Here we have the EM1 rifle. This is the predecessor to the EM2. They were actually developed at the same time, and then they would go with the best design. The EM1 came from the Corsac EM1 light machine gun, which was in 7.92 full caliber cartridge. That was dropped and this was proceeded with, but eventually this was dropped in preference to the EM2 design. And the EM1 is a roller lock design, which again draws from the developments in Germany. I think the Garat 4.5 was used as a model for the locking system. The receiver is pressed steel. Now, one of the reasons why it wasn't proceeded with, it was determined that the EM1 was more expensive to manufacture than the EM2, which seems strange nowadays because it's a pressed steel receiver, whereas that's the norm these days and it's the cheapest route to go down. Once you have the dies manufactured, you can stamp out many thousands of receivers. But at the time, British industry probably wasn't up to the same capability or standard that the Germans had, who've been doing it for a lot more
I think that's the thing.
time. And this is probably why the design wasn't proceeded with. It's got a pistol grip which is very reminiscent of the FG42 second model, and the cocking handle is interestingly on the opposite side of the EM2. It's on the left hand side, which for someone who is right-handed is much more natural, and you wouldn't drop the buttstock out of the shoulder to cock the weapon and then hand back on. The EM2 is much like today's SA80 or L85, where you'd have to cant it across and either use the weak hand or take your hand off the trigger and cock it that way.
That would be my preferred method, because you will do some serious damage to the knuckle of your hand if you
Yes.
try to cock it the other way and you're not extremely careful.
Well, it's one of the drawbacks of the bullpup in a way. Like I say, I've fired the EM2, and it is a little awkward to cock. The EM1, which I'd never seen before, looks a lot more natural to be able to cock it that way.
If you'd like to give that a go, they both have a great deal of inertia.
Right,
In terms of
the initial unlocking, which is typical of a roller lock or
Yeah.
a flapper lock. So, yes, that gives and then runs away with you.
So you're right, it is better
Yeah.
in terms of ergonomics, but it's perhaps a little bit harder. It's
Yeah.
almost more like, being roller locked, I guess. It's more like a G3 or something.
Yes, yes.
So you're not reaching up for the forend.
Now, that has locked open because we've got an empty magazine.
Actually, on this one, if I remember correctly, it will still lock open, and you'll have to operate the bolt
Right,
levers.
okay, so is this like an EM2 where a loaded magazine fitted will
Correct.
let it go forward? So that was obviously one of the design. Am I okay to let it run?
Yep.
Okay, I'll take the magazine off.
Which of course you'll need to manually operate the magazine catch because we don't have the ammunition to.
Yeah, okay. So the bolt hold open is.
It's the same as on the EM2, so you'll have to take the magazine off because you need to rock it the other way.
Ah,
There you go.
got you. Okay.
So they both have that feature in common, which is an interesting one.
Yes, it's not particularly intuitive.
Not intuitive, perhaps, and perhaps a bit unsafe. I
Yes.
don't know, because it's less positive. I don't know. That's one for the operators of these things to.
Well, I think if it had ever gone into service, people would have gotten into it and would have gotten used to it.
Yeah.
It's
It all comes down to drills, doesn't it?
Yes.
Whatever you're trained on.
Exactly.
It could be a useful feature to speed up your reloads. Bearing in mind it's a bullpup, and it's going to be harder to reach back with the
Yes.
magazine.
but it's a heavy gun.
It certainly is. Yeah.
The SE80, which I've shot a lot, and I'm not particularly enamoured of, it doesn't feel too good in my hands, although it's a very accurate gun. What I do like about this is the same as the FG42. The pistol grip, to me, and I've got large hands, fits in my hand quite well. And the selector and safety, which is a combination, falls under my thumb.
yeah.
So that's quite interesting, not because I haven't handled an EM1 before. The EM2 has a selector which is a button above the grip, and the safety is a bit like an M1 Garand, which is in the front of the trigger guard.
That's
Now,
right.
me being a very knowledgeable about the M1 Garand M14, that safety is very intuitive to me. I understand it and I can do it. But also being having fired the AR-15 M16 family, that selector under the thumb is also very intuitive. So
Yeah.
for me, muscle memory works great.
It's not a million miles away in terms of
Yeah,
the shape
yeah.
of the catch.
I
is it?
think if you have a small hand, you might be struggling.
Possibly.
Yeah. But the other thing I find as well, the magazine intrudes on my grip. I can't get. I'm sitting here at a very weird angle into the grip because the magazine's in the way.
I think it's just further forward, isn't it, than the
Yes.
L85?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think-
And bigger, of course.
Yes, yes.
Broader,
Much
wider.
larger.
Yeah.
Right. Now, let me.
But this was early days for bullpup military rifles.
Now,
So,
if I. There you go. Forward there. So the mechanism there looks quite exposed inside the above the magazine, but there is a dust cover on it,
there is.
which is obviously very good. I think it would have probably passed the dust tests, but these were all prototypes. They weren't production ready. Even the EM2, which was adopted as the rifle number 9, wasn't really ready for service.
I don't know offhand how many they had produced by that stage, but it hadn't entered full rate production, had it?
Well,
1951.
Of the 3 manufacturers, which was Enfield, I think Collins, and also BSA, who manufactured them, there was probably only around 56 manufactured in total. So it wasn't really finished final, but it was put into or it was adopted into service, probably because the then Labour government was coming up, or the election was coming up, and the Labour government wanted to say, right, okay, we've done this.
It's an interesting point I hadn't really considered. Yeah.
And then, of course, after the election, the Tories got in, Churchill went back in, and Churchill wanted to make sure that we didn't have any problems with our allies, the Americans, who were definitely wanting to adopt the T65 cartridge, which became 7.62 NATO, and they wanted to design of their own. So we redesigned it to use 7.62, which really was a bit overpowered, and it got nowhere. So we adopted it, and then Churchill knocked it on the head. And then we went down the route, another 3-4 years later, we adopted the FAL in 7.62. So we're going to have a look at the EM2 next and see some of the idiosyncrasies of that over the EM1, the Thorpe rifle.
I don't know if the viewers might have seen already, but for me a very striking image of 51 when they drew up the training pamphlets is of this guy in World War II battle dress.
Yes.
Virtually unchanged, so you know, webbing and everything, but armed with this futuristic space gun as it would have been in 1951.
Well, I remember a company I worked for at the time, we had an EM2 in 7.62, and I had a copy of that manual. The rifle we had was a BSA manufacturer, one in fact serial number 2, if anybody has it out there, I'd like to know who has it. We didn't have the optic sight on, that was missing, so we had to use the iron sights mainly. But it was a very, very hard recoiling gun, and you could tell 7.62 was just way, way too much for it. The ones that I've seen shot recently have all been 7.62 because 280 ammunition, it's not there.
And I think there are more of you've already established there are a few guns out there.
Yeah.
The ones that are out there tend to be 7.62.
Yes. So the two rifles look very, very similar, very strikingly similar, because they're bullpups. There's a combination of traditional wood and steel. The EM1 is a pressed steel receiver, which I think looks as though it's more businesslike than the EM2, which is a machined receiver, and to me looks quite flimsy. The chamber area is where all the meat is, and underneath there is the cartridge. And to me, that being right next to your face, it looks a bit too obvious.
You can see the ghost almost of the cartridge where it would sit, where they've taken away as much metal as they can, leaving this sort of rocket shaped or cartridge shaped power bulge, if you like.
Yeah, just in front of the ejection point, you can see where the chamber area is. So that barrel is that full length here. There are shortened versions, which we have in the collection here, which were supposed to be for vehicle crews or an SMG type replacement, but it's really only a shortened barrel. The cocking, like we said before, is on the right hand side, so you either have to take the trigger hand off and cock it, or cross over and cock like this, a la SA80. Trigger mechanism, the selector is a button cross bolt above the pistol grip, which isn't too difficult to manipulate. The safety is a push forward type, much like the M1 Garand M14 in
Probably
the trigger guard.
Great lift from that system.
Yeah, I think why reinvent the wheel at the end of the day? And it's described as a grenade-shaped forward grip. It's like a small pineapple, really. It's a very large palm swell, but it doesn't really give you any chance for anybody with a different stature to have a different grip.
No, certainly doesn't account for future trends in how we hold and operate our firearms.
Well, if you think about it, the number 4 rifle, which was the predecessor, and the FAL, the L1A1 in British parlance, which came after it, they were all available in different stock lengths for different statures. If you were lucky and you could get one that was assigned to you. But the EM1 and EM2 have no provision for that.
I'm not aware of any attempt to provide that, which is a tradition or a facility or feature.
Yeah.
It goes back at least as far as the Pattern 53
Yeah.
muzzle loading rifle, was that you had different butt lengths, and the same for the Enfield rifle.
Yes.
Bullpups tend not to have that feature.
Well,
there's a modern design, I think, that has a sort of extended butt plate, and if I remember rightly, the XL64 SA80 prototype, they experimented with different length butt plates. I'm not aware of that on the EM2.
Well, I know on the SA80 L85, you can move the optic sight forward and the fixed sight forward and back to allow for different statures, but it's usually frowned upon because of interchangeability, and you may not be issued the same rifle twice. So it's there's a slight drawback I could see in the issuing as well. Again, it has the same magazine between the two rifles, so there is a degree of interchangeability. Not that there was going to be any interchangeability, but a nice looking rifle, and to me, really one of the big things that Enfield was known for was the EM2. And it's always lauded as a very futuristic rifle, but we never ever see the EM1. And at a later date, we'll see also the predecessor to the EM1, the Corsac LMG, also known as the EM1. I think EM in that case stands for experimental model, and in this case it stands for Enfield model. But again, that isn't necessary. I've not seen an explanation of why they were both called the EM1. But definitely only one Corsac was ever built.
I think that what sums it up for me, apart from the, you've mentioned this being milled steel almost throughout, and if you take, in future we may well take it apart and demonstrate this, but the bolt carrier group is 12 separate components,
Yes.
all with individual machining operations required on there. So as you were saying earlier, the expense argument I don't quite see, except that obviously factories in the past were set up for different things. I think that has to be the explanation.
Yes.
But I think my favourite feature on this, and what epitomises it as a sort of a, I won't say white elephant because it may have been more better than that, but as a very British attempt at a post-war intermediate caliber assault rifle, is this walnut veneer cheek piece on here, which is just, you know, you've got milled or stamped steel, but we absolutely must have some beautiful walnut on there. And you can see why this one's seen a little bit of
well, yes, I think that with the wear and also at the age as well, it's probably caused it to pick up. You can tell that we weren't into synthetics then, because the butt plate on both these rifles, which is probably had some, was rubber and had some give in it, now after more than 70 years it's gone rock hard. Just
like the butt plates on those number 5s that everyone complains about shooting.
So I think part of the criticism that I had at the time firing this in 7.62 was partly down to the fact that the butt plate was rock hard.
And effectively, it's a very short stock.
Yes. The other thing I noticed as well on the EM1, the butt plate is about 1.5 inches wide, whereas on the EM2 it's about 1 inch. So you're concentrating all that recoil in a smaller area on the EM2.
It's true.
So perhaps the EM1 may have been more pleasant to shoot. I don't know. Not having had the opportunity.
No, not.
And not having a box of 280 ammunition either. So.
Quite, yeah.
So it's a lot of this is experience gained in firing the 7.62 EM2 that I've had. Never ever seeing an EM1 in the past, but seeing it now in the flesh and comparing the two is just a marvellous opportunity, and thank you, Jonathan, for letting us do that.
No problem.
The last thing that we will do, and I'll swap the EM2 out for the 280 FAL, is that over the years I've had a lot of experience in the FAL, both in 7.62 and in 7mm. I got to fire one quite a bit in 7mm, and all different manufacturers, either licensed build, Israeli ones, Dutch, German, British L1A ones. This was one of the very early rifles because it's in 280 caliber. So this was designed by WWII, a rifle that was a competitor to the EM1 and EM2, and ultimately it won out. but it lost out in the trials in America, although the Americans built it themselves. I think Harrington Richardson built the T-48s.
Yeah.
And they could have manufactured it in the US, but I think mainly out of politics and it not being an indigenous design.
Not made here.
That's right.
Yeah, well, we were as guilty of that.
Well, exactly. We were going to go down that route. But in fact, we had to stamp our imperialness on it by changing it from metric to inch pattern.
Yes, causing all sorts of problems.
Yes, and I think the panel I remember reading about was called the BBC panel, and that was British, Belgians and Canadians who went through and changed all the drawings from metric to imperial measurements, and then the drawings were swapped between the Canadians and us Brits, and the Canadians made the C1 and the C1A1.
Yeah.
They also made the light machine gun version, or the heavy barrel FAL version, which we didn't adopt. We had the L1A1, and the Australians had the L1A1 as well, and they had the L2A1,
Yeah.
which was their heavy barrel version as well.
Yeah.
So we'll look at those at a later date, but this is a very rare chance that you'll get to see a 280 caliber FAL. It's almost identical to a 7.62. It has a few idiosyncrasies. The change levers slightly different. The takedown lever is exactly the same as a Belgian FAL. The cocking handle is a hook. It's not a folding one. It doesn't reciprocate, but it's exactly the same. There's very little difference between this and a 7.62 FAL that's made anywhere, except it's in 280 caliber.
It's kind of different in every tiny detail,
Yes.
but overall it's the same gun, isn't it?
Well, it's looking on the side. This is definitely an FN manufactured one.
Yeah.
Although some of the prototypes and WWII worked in England during the war and developed the SLEM1,
Yes.
which eventually became the SEFN 49
Yeah.
and the AFM 49, and that directly then evolved into the FAL, or the Free World's Right Arm, as it's commonly known.
Yeah. People are always asking where that phrase comes from, or speculating as to where it comes from. I think it's from the book.
Yes.
I think that was a great title to come up with for the big book.
Yes.
On the rifle, and maybe it was being used in gun circles before that. I honestly don't know. It's before my time, but I found no reference to it before that.
No.
It's kind of true, but
Well, I know that when I was first introduced to the FAL, that in British parlance it was always called the SLR, which is just self-loading rifle.
Exactly.
And it was the first self-loading rifle that the British Army adopted in great quantities. And
it's a bit behind the curve there.
Yeah.
In a way.
yeah, we were a bit slow on the take-up.
A little bit.
And I think that everybody else had trialled semi-automatic rifles, and so had we.
As far back as the First World War.
Yes, and but we just wouldn't take it up, and I think there was a reticence to issue a weapon that could use ammunition up at a great rate.
There always was, definitely, an institutional reluctance to go for rapid fire, but also in terms of I don't know if it is a military adage, but it ought to be, like, that good enough is good enough.
Yes.
We could already work those bolts down fast. So why would you need a more complicated, expensive thing that has the same effective rate of fire?
Yeah.
I think was the thinking. Because we kept trialling them, but it wasn't until 57 until they actually started appearing.
Well, I think it's interesting as well that it wasn't really until the adoption of the 7.62 cartridge that Britain definitely adopted a self-loading weapon, and then stuck with it for many years.
Good point, yeah.
Until really the early 80s, when the SE80 family, the L85A1 and L85A2, were adopted probably a little bit too quickly.
Sort of, and yet at the same time the development process took
Yes.
far too long, so it was a curious mixture of the two. I know they were looking at a replacement certainly by the turn of the 70s, early 70s. And interestingly enough, on the basis that the SLRs were all wearing out,
Yes.
and that it was going to cost too much to just make more. Don't quite follow that, especially as, of course, the British Army was already shrinking by that time.
Mm.
And now we can simply supply spares for SA-80s for decades to come because the army is not that big anymore.
Yes. Well, it's also it's strange as well that the British Army was one of the very early adopters, although it wasn't issued in the great numbers, of the AR-15 family.
Yes. Same year as the US Army.
That's right. 5,000 weapons were purchased,
Yeah.
mainly for areas where we might get involved with jungle warfare. And then a lot of those weapons were then gifted to the indigenous population.
Right. Okay.
So we didn't keep a hold of an awful lot of them. But it's also, I find it interesting, and Jonathan and I were discussing this earlier, that the takedown of the AR-15, you can take the whole lower off normally. The British Army thought that was a bit of a risk. So we'll put a bolt through the front takedown pin so you can't take it apart. And it opens and cleans like a shotgun, a la the SLR.
I think that'll be a subject probably for another
Yes.
video. However, it's not on all of them.
No.
Now, obviously, a lot of the ARs we've got of that era are test and evaluation examples. So maybe in the field they were always fitted, and certainly photos from the Falklands of Royal Marines with them, they have that cheesy bolt through that. I also wondered if it wasn't that these are originals from the 60s, hence why we called it the Armalite, I think, because they all had the Armalite written on them. Perhaps there's also some play developing between the receivers, and that's to shore that up. We'll have to discuss that later.
We'll look into that. We'll look into that later. So anyway, so here we have, like I say, 3 very early .280 caliber rifles that ultimately the EM was left behind in preference to the EM2. The EM2 was adopted into British service, but actually never issued and never manufactured. And then the whole of that decision-making process was overturned when a change of government came in, and eventually 4 years later we adopted the FAL in 7.62. So it's interesting to see the range of designs that ultimately were rejected. But then we came back to the bullpup concept in the 60s, and one of the next videos we'll see is how that XL series, the experimental series, came about, and how the design was plagiarized a little bit. But that's for another video. Okay? So thank you, Jonathan.
No worries.
And we'll see you next time.
At the School of Infantry, Warminster, many spectators witnessed a demonstration of the new British rifle in comparison with older weapons. They saw the American Garand rifle in action. The .303 Lee Enfield, the present British Army rifle. And here's the new self-loading rifle, the .280, which, as you see, is revolutionary. Shorter and lighter with an optical sight, it handles like a Sten gun and can fire over 80 single rounds a minute. It penetrates steel helmets at 600 yards. In fact, the .280 is a first-class piece of work, as Lieutenant General Sir Richard Gale confirms.
This rifle has certain advantages. It is light, it is easy to handle, it is easy to train the man to use, it is accurate, and it will stand up to hard usage. It has a high velocity, and it has a good killing power.